to help me with that. Okay, so we've got just we've got just under an hour. So what I had planned for the session is sort of to split it a little bit in half, to give you a little bit of background, really just very briefly, to decolonizing the curriculum, the kind of roots of that. I hope I can do it justice. I mean, it's such a big topic, and it has arms and legs, and it's really difficult to speak to it, but I will try. And then in the second half, I thought we could do something a bit more discursive and practical, and I wanted to introduce a framework that I work with my PG CAP students, and it's the Decolonizing the Curriculum wheel by Musharat Ahmed Landayu. There are so many frameworks and toolkits that you can use, so this is just one I've picked, which I found asks the right sort of questions in terms of making this kind of work real and pragmatic for learning and teaching. So that's the rough plan. So let's maybe start at the very beginning, because when I kind of started out working in decolonizing the curriculum, I sort of entered the decolonizing the curriculum community of practice, and I entered it because I wanted to know more. But in the end, I ended up co-leading it and doing the work rather than knowing that much about it. So I sort of did my own a little bit of research of where this actually all comes from. And so that's kind of what I'm going to share with you right now. And I hope it answers some questions, because sometimes it can be quite bewildering where decolonizing starts and where it actually ends and what we can do in practice. So decoloniality is a political and epistemological project that, and I say political because that's why it can trigger resistance and backlash. So this is not just an educational project. This goes to the very heart of some political movements globally, and it also questions the way we establish knowledge, the way we create knowledge, the way we teach knowledge. So it's sort of, can be seen as quite subversive in questioning the ways of knowing that we are trained in and that we are socialized in, and it's sort of pulling at all the strands and can sort of unravel the way we kind of see ourselves as educationalists in the world. So let's start with a bit of history to make it a bit concrete. So historically, it's linked to political movements in South America and other colonized regions, sometimes referred to as the Global South. I'm sure you're very familiar with that term. So it questions how we create and validate knowledge. I've hinted at that just there. And at the very basis of decolonizing the curriculum is that it acknowledges that there's a plurality of knowledges globally. However, this is not reflected in our higher education curricula. So certain knowledges are marginalized, are excluded, are seen as less valuable as some other knowledge traditions that are privileged and are prioritized in our educational systems. So decoloniality finds different expressions in different historic and socio-political contexts, and the more kind of the movement that we are operating within at the moment goes back to the year 2014. So it's already, 11 years old, and it's linked to an event and a movement called Roads Must Fall. You probably have heard about this as well. And to give you a little bit of that background, it was basically a protest in South Africa against how education is operating there. So basically, you have to see this in the context of South Africa having been a colony of Britain, and Cecil Rhodes was one of the colonizers who operated there. And you had historical situations where you had a poor Black population and white supremacy reigning, and basically gatekeeping access to wealth, educational systems, and so on, and everything that comes, the injustice that comes with that. And even if Black students could access the educational system, the curriculum that was taught there was a colonial one, was basically, and was taught in English rather than in the language, that languages that were locally spoken. So that protest during that year and the following year sort of swept over to the UK. There's so you can see the statue of Cecil Rhodes here is being removed in Cape Town in 2015. There's another statue in Oxford. I actually don't know whether it's still standing, so I'm just trying to make the link to the UK. And the movement here was had a slightly different expression in that it came from basically marginalized students of color who were growing up in the UK but felt that their curriculum wasn't representing them, that authors that were on the canon and on the reading list were mainly white, the teachers were mainly white, so it led to the question of, why is my curriculum so white? And there's actually a really good video out there that goes into that a little bit more. I can share it afterwards if you want. So there are links sort of globally, but different expressions in different socio-political contexts. So just to give you that a little bit of some cornerstones here. As I say, I can't really do it justice. It's such a big topic. But if you're interested in the more conceptual framework or conceptual history of this topic, there is a book by Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh, who have written about decoloniality as a concept, but not just theoretically. They also looked into the social history of how this concept has developed. And they looked into the social history of South America, for example. Not going to talk too much about it. It's quite a densely written text, and you could question the value of such a densely written text because it comes from two very established academics who are trained in knowledge traditions that are very, very Western. So it's quite exclusive in a way that people that have not studied sociology or social history or are trained in these arts and humanities and social scientific ways of thinking will find it difficult to read. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because they actually talk about two institutions that we can sort of think about a little bit as a thought experiment here in this workshop. So one is Amataba Vasi, House of Wisdom, in Ecuador. So Ecuador, in the political history of South America, at some point became a decolonial and intercultural state, and the educational system was actually changed through that. So this type of university, the House of Wisdom, tried to place indigenous and Western knowledge in relation to one another, and was working as a product of a political process in the first instance. But the problem that university faced was that it had to go through approval processes and had to be basically signed off by the Ministry of Education, and was eventually shut down on the basis of lacking quality. So working within certain power structures, this institution. There's another, it will make sense in a minute why I'm bringing this up. There's another institution that Catherine Walsh and Mignolo talk about, and that's in Mexico, the University of the Earth, which is similar in that it tries to place indigenous and Western knowledges in relation to one another, but it works outside of established power structures. So they're basically not ratified or accredited by a Ministry of Education. So they are operating independently from that. So the dilemma that decolonial institutions or decolonial initiatives face is, are you doing it from the outside? Are you doing it from the inside? And how do you do that against colonial power structures? Now, these are examples from South America. So very different from the context that we are working with. And this Amatwasi House of Wisdom actually opened again. I don't know at what point, but the ethnologist Anna Meiser was studying it, and you can see a picture here of basically a lecturer from that university going into the communities there and working with locally on certain topics. And Anna Meiser actually at some point invited the rector of the university to Germany to look at our educational structures rather than her as an ethnologist going out there and studying the House of Wisdom as an institution. So she tried to flip the coin a little bit because ethnologists always study the other. So instead, Anna sort of brought the other in and made them study our educational system as something that's strange to them. So the rector of that university found and reported back that our educational structures are quite hierarchical, and that our universities are very focused on producing knowledge for knowledge's sake, while this university, so the House of Wisdom, really the principle is about we're creating knowledge to make a difference to the communities that we're working with. So there's more of a connection with actually the locality within which higher education is set. So why I bring this up, it's sort of the first question I want to raise. So as I said, this House of Wisdom was closed in 2013, and the Ministry of Education cited that the university did not meet the minimum quality standards set by the National Council of Evaluation. And I want to ask you, and I'm going to turn the recording off, do you feel similar issues could arise from decolonizing the curriculum here? And if so, and I'm sure you have already encountered them, do you think that these relate to quality, to actual quality, or do you think they relate to power, basically a power paradigm? And then if so, how might colonial practice then be challenged from within? Because the reality is we live within these power structures while maintaining education quality standards. So let me just pause. Okay, so the problem that we are working with is obviously different from the problems the universities in South America or South Africa are working with. We are actually trying to decolonize in the UK, the land of the colonizers. So all our structures are colonial, are racist, and it's really difficult to get away from that. And the argument around quality and excellence is linked to meritocracy and racism. So the idea is that, oh, we have to reject because it's not good enough. It's just used or weaponized in this way. So basically, Musharat Ahmad Landayu presented this Decolonizing the Curriculum wheel at a symposium, I think it's now 3 years ago. And she is a professor at South Bank University. She created 12 also focus groups. So she did research into this with students and what would be needed, or what kind of people have to think about when they want to start out with this kind of work. And this is how she came up with this framework. So for us, basically, decolonizing the curriculum is about reinserting knowledges and ways of knowing that have been excluded and pushed to the margins. I would even extend that to bring in other forms of presenting that knowledge, like, not just working with essays and texts and academic articles, but focusing more on the oral representation or in other formats, creative ways of kind of creating and expressing knowledge. So to kind of unpack this wheel a little bit, she suggests to focus on kind of 3 aspects when you kind of start doing this kind of work. So at the center of it is, it's basically about students. The student voice has to be absolutely key and centered in this work. So the question then for you would be, how do you do that? So I come back to that because otherwise I have to stop the recording again. So how do you bring students into this kind of work? Then you can't do everything at once. So having a focus on a particular aspect of your curriculum is really important. So is it the teaching practice, the pedagogy that you want to change? So for example, if you are, just an example from working with international students, so if in your subject area there's lots of seminar discussions that require language proficiency as well as confidence and a sense of entitlement to speak up in class, then seminar discussions as such might have to be either prepared and scaffolded in a certain way to bring in students that haven't had that experience. So often, for example, international students that come from other educational cultures where it's more teacher-centered might be unfamiliar with this kind of pedagogy. So how can you center their experience so you can meet them halfway and make your pedagogy more teacher-centered if you think that's useful? I don't think there's anything wrong with that if there's an argument to be made. Or can you give them opportunities to practice that seminar discussion, that kind of the kind of how you express yourself and in a class. So is it the way you teach students, or is it about certain topics and content? So is there something you can do around bringing in case studies from other places globally, or authors? We talked about that already. Is it your assessment practice that could change? So for example, is there, if your discipline is very essay-based, the question is who's being excluded by focusing on the written word? Is there something else that could be done? A podcast, for example, as an assessment, comes with a lot of challenges and problems. I'm just floating ideas. Or is it about, are you working on institutional responsibility? So more kind of strategic level work. And also how are you measuring the outcomes of the kind of changes you're trying to do? So creating a focus just to also protect your own sanity and your own mental health when doing this kind of work, because it will lead to burnout eventually if you don't have strong boundaries. And then, so that's sort of the middle, that's the spokes of the wheel here. I don't know how well you can read that, but it's basically speaking to those. And then the spoke rim, or here around that, will basically be is basically about having the bigger picture and the bigger perspective, and not just focusing on the work you're planning to do, but really about how you make sure that's impactful, not just performative, that you can actually sustain those changes over a longer period of time. So for example, I'm just kind of one example, if you want to put a workshop on for your colleagues on convincing them to do this kind of work, what happens after the workshop? Like, first of all, how do you get people to come to the workshop? How do you convince them that this work is important? And then how do you check in with them again that this work is actually being carried forward? Is there senior managers you have to work with to really create impact within your discipline? So it's kind of asking these kind of questions, I think, makes this work a little bit more pragmatic and less, oh, I don't know where to start kind of thing, or I'm doing all this kind of work, but I don't see any results. So, so this is just as a suggestion. So let's go back to centering students, and I'm going to turn the recording off again and want to hear more from you at this point.